The Minnesota Golden Gophers are coming off of back-to-back 9-4 seasons. They went 6-3 in the Big Ten West in 2021, 5-4 in the Big Ten West just this past season. Minnesota will be playing its final year in the Big Ten West division, as it is widely assumed that the Big Ten will be abolishing divisions after USC and UCLA join the conference in 2024. It would not make sense for USC and UCLA to join the Big Ten West and have the West Division give up a team to the Big Ten East. That would not make sense. 8 teams in 2 distinct divisions. The large consensus, almost the unanimous consensus, seems to be that no division should be allowed. Best 2 teams get to go to the Big Ten championship game. I think it might be cool to have the top 4 Big Ten teams have a tournament where you have a semifinal and then a championship game, like the current 4-team playoff. And then from there, they get to go to the playoff, depending on if they finish high enough or they win the Big Ten, so on. But it's really interesting, and I intend to, in a series of mine, which I want to do this summer, I intend to do a documentary on each Power 5 conference and include some of my thoughts on what each conference should do, so on and so forth. That's if, of course, all of them survive into the summer, as the Pac-12 and ACC seem to be crumbling. But anyway, I spent a minute diverging from the topic at hand. We're talking about Minnesota here. Minnesota, and I mentioned the Big Ten West and Big Ten expansion because the West Division has been by far the weakest division in the Big Ten. There's no debate about that. The West Division has never won a Big Ten championship game, and I'm 99% sure they won't, whether it's Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Nebraska, Northwestern, Purdue, Illinois, whoever it is. They're probably not beating whoever wins the East. Most likely Michigan, Ohio State, Penn State following close behind. Maybe Michigan State or Maryland could cook something up. Who knows? The games decide themselves after all on the Saturdays in the fall season. But I don't think the West is in a good position. They never have been in a good position when you compare it to the East. And the disillusion of divisions will likely negatively affect the teams in the West to a certain degree. It provides a greater opportunity, one, because you're going to get tougher schedules, have more big games, more top-ranked matchups, but on the other hand, because of the mass talent disparity, teams in the Big Ten West are likely going to see more losses. They're going to accumulate more losses per season than they have in the era of the Big Ten West. Iowa's not going to be able to finish with 10 wins anymore, more likely than not, with how they currently play football, if they played more Big Ten East opponents, including occasionally USC, UCLA. It just doesn't work. The West, some would argue, is actually the weakest sector of Power 5 college football, which is funny because the Big Ten is often viewed as the second strongest conference in Power 5, which just shows how good the Big Ten East is, how bad the Big Ten West is. In fact, there's an argument that the East of the Big Ten could be the strongest division in college football. The West could be the weakest. And I think actually that was the case last year, as Michigan and Ohio State were college football playoff teams, while the Big Ten West was just pure garbage for most of the year in 2022. But back to Minnesota. Minnesota has an opportunity, I think, to show out and finally reach Indianapolis in PJ Fleck's final year in the West Division. After that, it will become, in the broad scheme of things, it will become tremendously harder, but Minnesota's schedule is already tough. They play Michigan and Ohio State in the regular season, so in a certain sense, Minnesota's 2023 schedule is warming them up for what the future of Big Ten play will look like. And while that may seem bleak, along with a road game at Iowa in October, and of course, the annual rivalry matchup with Wisconsin to conclude the regular season, a Power 5 non-conference road game at North Carolina, and starting the year off at home, but nonetheless against a Power 5 conference opponent in Nebraska. The schedule to a certain degree might seem bleak, and I know a lot of people are anticipating Minnesota to fall off this year, losing Tanner Morgan, Mohamed Ibrahim, their center John Michael Schmitz, along with other contributing players, John Michael Schmitz and Mohamed Ibrahim being elite players. Huge losses for Minnesota. But Minnesota starter Athan Kaliakmanis is going to likely be the starting quarterback. He's in competition with Cole Kramer, and he improved throughout the year. He started many games because of Tanner Morgan's continuous injuries that just kept compounding throughout the 2022 season. So at least you have experience in the starting quarterback position and in the quarterback room overall. Cole Kramer has been used before in run-specific plays, so he also has experience. So it's not a typical situation where the starter departs, the backup's a completely green player. Both Athan Kaliakmanis and Cole Kramer do have starting experience. At the running back room, Mohamed Ibrahim is being replaced by Sean Tyler from Western Michigan. Now, moving from the MAC to the Big Ten, I imagine is going to be quite the wake-up call, quite the transformation. But Minnesota's offensive line returns both their tackles, and I'm confident that the offensive line will still be a good to great offensive line. Sean Tyler had back-to-back 1,000-yard rushing seasons in 2022 and 2021. He had over 200 carries, tied for 31st in the country with 209 this past season. He had 1,027 rushing yards, 7 rushing touchdowns, and he averaged 4.9 yards per carry on the ground behind a porous offensive line at Western Michigan, where their head coach Tim Lester was fired after the conclusion of this past season. At wide receiver, Mike Brown-Stevens moved on to the transfer portal, but Chris Autman-Bell returns as a redshirt senior. Daniel Jackson, Lemeke Brockington, guys who got significant playing time, they return. And Corey Crooms, another player from Western Michigan, is being added and is currently projected to be a starter at wide receiver. He had 814 receiving yards last year with 5 receiving touchdowns, 57 receptions, which was tied for 90th in the country, and he averaged 14.3 yards per reception, which was 137th in the nation. And Minnesota also brought in Elijah Spencer from the transfer portal as well. So their wide receiver room, I've mentioned this before, is deep. I was low on Minnesota myself until I watched the spring game, studied the transfer portal, and I just think that Minnesota is a team that is actually poised for one of its better seasons despite its schedule. Because, admittedly, playing both Michigan and Ohio State in the same season, along with Wisconsin, Iowa, you have a non-conference Power 5 opponent, that's pretty crazy. That's a really tough schedule, but I think PJ Fleck and the Gophers can manage it. Minnesota's main strength is obviously in their receiving core, in my opinion. You got tight end Brevyn-Spann Ford, who returns along with all main starting wide receivers. Chris Autman-Bell being the biggest one. The Gophers do have question marks in the interior offensive line, but I'm confident those are going to be rectified. No, replacing John Michael Schmitz is not going to be easy, and I don't think the projected starting center or whoever ends up replacing him, currently Nathan Bowie, or maybe it's just Nathan Bowe, sorry if I messed that up, is the projected starting center, but I think that he'll be good. I think Tyler Cooper and Quinn Carroll transferred in from Notre Dame in the 2022 transfer portal class. I think that will be a solid interior offensive line. Minnesota will still be able to run the football very well, but their strength is in their receiving core. Their tight end room, Brevyn-Spann Ford, is an absolute weapon, and Athan Kaliakmanis does give some mobility at quarterback. much more mobility, actually, than Tanner Morgan. He's a dual threat quarterback, a solid dual threat quarterback. On defense, there are also question marks. Minnesota does return some key playmakers on defense, and they do add guys via the transfer portal. Overall, I'm not concerned with the defense, as Joe Rossi is a proven defensive coordinator. Minnesota had one of the best defenses in the nation in 2021. They had a great defense in 2022 and 2019. And I think at this point, it's kind of like Jim Leonard's defense at Wisconsin. It's also, if you look at it, it's kind of like Luke Fickell's defenses at Ohio State, Mike Tressel's at Michigan State when they were coaching as defensive coordinators at those respective schools. They just kind of retool, reload. I think it's what Michigan has done under Mike McDonald and Jesse Minner. It's certainly what Georgia has done with then Dan Lanning, now Glenn Schumann and Will Muschamp. The great defensive teams and really the great programs, period. They lock in, they recruit well, and most importantly, they develop well and reload at their positions. Minnesota, we have not seen that in offense. They really only had one great offensive year, which is 2019. However, the Golden Gophers have consistently fielded some of the nation's best defenses, which is very impressive considering the fact that they are not a high-profile school when it comes to recruiting or resources. Their current win total is at 6.5. So 6-6 or 7-5 by that logic is kind of the consensus prediction for Minnesota. Mine used to be around there. It was 6-6, 7-5, maybe 8-4. But as revealed in my post-spring top 25, I currently have the Minnesota Golden Gophers going 9-3, 6-3 in conference. They have both Ohio State and Michigan as opponents, and I think those two will be losses. They don't have the talent to face up against either, and I think both have better coaching staffs. Ohio State is home field advantage. Michigan, they host them. It is in October, and I still think that Michigan and Ohio State are just, regardless of whether Minnesota's playing home or away, wildly better teams, but you never know what can happen, so we'll see. But just to run through the schedule briefly, Thursday, August 31st is when Minnesota opens up at home against Nebraska. Saturday, September 9th, they host Eastern Michigan before traveling on the road at North Carolina September 16th. That will be an ultimate test for Minnesota's defense, who returns some key secondary players, as they will be on the road facing Drake May, one of the best quarterbacks in the nation. So that will be, I think that should be an entertaining game to watch. North Carolina is a team that is all offense, little to no defense, and while I don't think Minnesota is that unbalanced, they certainly lean more defense for sure. So I'm curious to see between the two schools who comes out on top. Also, both lost their offensive coordinator. Obviously, Kirk Ciarrocca left for Rutgers, and North Carolina's offensive coordinator, Phil Longo, is now at Minnesota's rival school, Wisconsin, as their offensive coordinator, and he's instituting his model of the air raid there. After a road game at North Carolina, on September 23rd, Minnesota travels to Northwestern. They then return home to play their final non-conference opponent, the Louisiana Ragin' Cajuns, Saturday, September 30th. On Saturday, October 7th, is the Michigan game that will be at home for Minnesota. That should be a huge game, and one that I personally would pay attention to, as I think that Nebraska, Eastern Michigan, North Carolina, Northwestern, and Louisiana should all be wins for the Minnesota Gophers. So I think that Michigan and Minnesota will enter this game undefeated. It will be an undefeated matchup. I do think Michigan will win. The bye week, October 14th, will provide Minnesota and PJ Fleck and his staff time to prepare for a road game at Iowa, October 21st. If Spencer Petras was still quarterback, and if this was a game that was at home for the Gophers, I would pick PJ Fleck to finally break the streak here. But it's on the road at quarterback for Iowa. They obviously upgrade adding Cade McNamara, who led Michigan to their success and a 12-2 season with a win over Ohio State in 2021. And they replaced their outgoing wide receiver talent. They lost Arlen Bruce and Keegan Johnson, but they replaced them with Seth Anderson, Caleb Brown, who are more than capable of helping Iowa's offense to at least be competent. So I think that October 21st matchup against Iowa at Kinnick Stadium will be Minnesota's second loss on the year. Minnesota then returns home to play Michigan State October 28th, which I think will be a win. They also host Illinois November 4th, who they've had problems beating. Saturday, November 11th, they travel on the road to play Purdue. I think Michigan State, Illinois, and Purdue will all be wins for Minnesota. A road game at Ohio State November 18th will just be insanely tough to overcome. Ohio State has the most talent out of all teams in the Big Ten. It's in a stadium that has a capacity of over 100,000. The Horseshoe's an incredibly hard place to win, even though that will be the game for Ohio State before the Michigan game, which means it could be a trap game, like how the Illinois-Michigan game was last year. We'll just have to wait and see what happens. And we'll have to see how the two teams enter that matchup but I would anticipate Ohio State to handle Minnesota pretty easily, which is the huge talent disparity and the fact that it's a home game. And then finally, Minnesota hosts Wisconsin to finish off the year. I think the Ohio State game will be a huge loss, but the Wisconsin game will be a huge win. So 9-3, 6-3 again. I do think, I could be wrong, and we won't know until, of course, the regular season occurs and plays out, and Saturday after Saturday we'll track that, of course. But I would say that Minnesota is more likely than not to cover that 6.5 win total. Because you look at it, Minnesota and Ohio State, those are guaranteed, not Minnesota and Ohio State, but Michigan and Ohio State. Those are guaranteed 2 losses. Iowa and Wisconsin, that's tough. And maybe a road game at North Carolina is too, but even if PJ Fleck lost all those games, Michigan State, Illinois, at Purdue, at Northwestern, Nebraska, Eastern Michigan, and Louisiana, Minnesota is more established than all of those teams from a coaching staff standpoint, a stability standpoint, and I just think that Minnesota has more talent than a lot of those schools do. Maybe not Nebraska and Michigan State, but they certainly have a better track record than those remaining 7 schools. So I think the Gophers are set up to have success. I think there are plenty of reasons for this. There are also plenty of reasons that they could, faceplant. I think Athan Kaliakmanis is one of the bigger question marks, as is always the case when you have a new starting quarterback. However, compare his game against Penn State to his game against Wisconsin or the bowl game against Syracuse, and he is just exponentially grown since his first official start at Penn State. And he finished the 2023 season with a 75.7 QBR. That is a very high quarterback ranking. I think it's top 25. As a comparison, Michigan starter J.J. McCarthy finished with a 79.1 QBR. So yeah, it's definitely a top 25 QBR there. And Athan Kaliakmanis is not just proven that he is a solid, competent passer, but he can also scramble quite well, in fact. He has good speed, good size, and I do like him as a quarterback. I don't think that he's going to be an elite quarterback. Probably won't have the same performance as Tanner Morgan in 2019, but he is a solid quarterback, and you also have a experienced guy in Cole Kramer, who I think has only just this year or maybe an additional year of eligibility left. Brevyn-Spann Ford, Daniel Jackson, Chris Autman-Bell, and Corey Crooms have over 5,000 career yards and 36 career touchdowns. So you have an explosive, developed, experienced receiver room that Athan Kaliakmanis can throw to. That's really good. That gives him some cushion, because it's not just him and his room that is inexperienced with starting and passing the ball. And then you also have an inexperienced or questionable receiver core. You don't have that. You have a very experienced supporting cast. Also forgot to mention that on Minnesota's offensive line, I do believe they return both of their starting tackles. So pass pro for Minnesota should be solid. There should not be much fall off when it comes to pass protection for the Minnesota Golden Gophers. And then on defense, Tyler Nubin and Justin Wally return to anchor a defensive secondary that should be one of the better in the nation. The defense overall, I think, will be solid, as typical of a Joe Rossi defense. And I like it. I like this team a whole lot, and I think that there are reasons for success. There are reasons for failure, and one of those I would say would be if Athan Kaliakmanis just doesn't do well. I think that the interior of the offensive line, if it is bad or just average, and they face the Iowas, Wisconsins, the Big Ten West teams with solid defenses, even Illinois, who returns enough production on defense and enough play at the defensive line to where they could be a big threat, I think that Minnesota could be in trouble if that's the case. And against teams like Illinois, Wisconsin, Iowa, who are Big Ten West teams with great defenses, and Ohio State and Michigan, who also have great defenses, then it could be a big problem. I'd actually say that the interior of the offensive line, in Minnesota's case, is probably more important than the question at quarterback, since we've seen Athan Kaliakmanis play significant snaps. We know the receiver room is good. The biggest question is the interior of that offensive line. And while I don't think it's good to say that they'll just do plug and play and there will be no drop-off, you got to give some benefit of the doubt there, seeing that they developed John Michael Schmitz into the awesome center that he was and is. So I think Minnesota, for 2023, they will have a good year, and they will for sure be Big Ten West contenders. Thank you guys for watching. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe, like this video, and comment your thoughts on Minnesota football down below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all around. Bye-bye.